over and over again people that started out Whiskerville with good intentions.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she had the best of intentions to have a sanctuary for those cats, and it turned into a nightmare.
Yeah, there's more to caring for animals than just no kill, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Hey everybody, welcome back. This is another episode of the Lifeline podcast, and today I'm so excited to have Kim Schoolcraft on with us. Kim is our board chair for Lifeline of Galveston County, but she has just extensive experience in animal welfare. She has run 2 municipal shelters in our community, and you were a police officer before that, so
Yes.
that's so cool. So let's just start at the beginning. What drew you into animal welfare work, first as a police officer and then as a shelter director?
Well, back in the 70s, when I was on the police department, when I first went on, Galveston Island had no shelter at all.
Okay.
So all stray animals went to UTMB. And if they weren't found by their owners in 3 days, they were either destroyed or used for research. So I did
Really?
not want to bring a stray animal to UTMB for that reason. So when I would find a stray animal, which patrolling the streets of Galveston were frequently, I would take it home and deflea it and whatever needed to be done, and then try to find a home for it. And actually, I was pretty successful. And this was before the internet, before social media, so it was just word of mouth and
Whoa.
networking. And usually it was police officers and firefighters and EMS that I found homes for the animals with. So that's kind of how I got started.
That's cool. We never talked about that.
Hmm.
Yeah, like so you just word of mouth would be like, I have this dog or this cat
Yeah,
or okay.
absolutely. And
Did
it's
they
one.
have animal control officers or was the police department also that
It
was
was
part of your job as well?
um no, there were no animal control officers
Mm-hmm.
that I remember.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
there might actually, I'm wrong. There were animal control officers. They
Mm-hmm.
were mostly useless.
That's funny.
Absolutely useless. I can
Yeah.
remember one time there was someone had tied a cinder block around a dog and threw it in one of the bayous, and the dog was just had its head above the water just barely, and it was a swampy, green, nasty water, and the animal control officer refused to go in. So
Mm.
one of our motorcycle officers actually took off his boots and his gun belt and waded in that green, murky, nasty water and fished the
Whoa.
dog out.
Good for that guy. Wow.
So yeah,
Yeah, you're like, no, I do remember
yeah, I do
the
remember.
non-great office. um, so what were some of the earlier moments then that kind of shaped your philosophy about animal sheltering?
um,
Because I mean,
animals,
that's like a way different
right?
introduction than I had for sure.
I
Yeah.
started after I retired in the year 2000, and my sister was diagnosed with a terminal illness, so I took care of her until she passed away. But in between, I volunteered
Mm-hmm.
at a couple of animal shelters actually, and you know, observing, wasn't liking what I saw.
Mm-hmm.
Not that the people didn't care.
It's a
It
very
was just it
broken
was the
system.
system
Yeah.
was broken, and most animals did not make it out alive. And
Mhm.
there was no vet care, there was no vaccination, so diseases ran rampant through. If there's parvo and distemper and panleukopenia and all of those things, were always running through the shelters, and it was I just thought we could do better than this. We could do better.
Yeah. That's that reminds me when I went to a conference in like 2018 or something, and I there was a presentation on like animal control, the history of animal control, which really was mind blowing. And that they used to just like round dogs up, and they would actually, speaking of your cinder block thing, they would put them in cages and drown them in the river.
Mm-hmm.
And then then people started kind of, you have your first animal advocates, and then that was the 3 day thing. Well, okay, we'll
Right.
give them 3 days to
Right.
reclaim your pet, and then after that, it is what it is. And we still kind of work off that 3 day period. It's getting better, but um, what a change! And I mean, you just saying the stuff in the 70s. I can't even imagine living in that as an animal person.
Yeah.
So,
It was dark time. I'll say that.
Yeah. So does
Mm.
that, like, the change from what you once saw till now, does that, how do you feel about it? Does that give you hope? Do you feel like we've made good
Oh,
progress?
we've made tremendous progress.
Mm.
I mean, there's still, the shelters, and I'm going to say specifically the municipal shelters, they still struggle.
Mm.
And it's mostly because there are people making decisions about financing and length of stay that aren't animal people.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they're very rigid policies and rules. So there's no gray area for them. It's black and white. And we know in animal welfare that's not the case. There's always gray. So you
Mm.
have to be flexible. One case is not like the next one. And for instance, in municipal shelters, the main reason that they were started was to do rabies control.
Mm.
Well, there hasn't been a case of rabies in a domestic animal in Galveston County since the 70s, so mission accomplished.
Yeah.
But they still operate under that rabies control rigid um, doctrine.
Yeah.
So there's no flexibility in that. And
Mm.
I find that kind of disturbing.
Yeah.
Um, Not every animal that bites someone is is there's to me there's a difference between a defensive or an offensive bite. If I
Mm-hmm.
step on the dog's tail and it turns around and bites me, that's my fault.
Yeah.
Um, if my child is riding a bicycle down the street and a dog attacks him, that's a different kind of a bite.
Right.
So, but you have to have those nuances, and know what's the difference. So, I wouldn't say that every dog that bit someone needed automatically to be euthanized.
Mm-hmm.
But there were some dogs that were actually dangerous and they did need to be euthanized for the good of the community.
Yeah.
So,
That makes sense.
and that's kind of the dual role that municipal shelters play because not only are they protecting the life of the animals, they also have to protect the life of the community.
Mm-hmm.
So, and human life always has to take precedent.
Absolutely. What do you think when you see, like, those stories? There was one recently of, like, a woman mauled in Houston to death.
Yeah, I see those frequently.
Mm-hmm.
It's just horrible,
Mm-hmm.
and there's some animals, and especially when the own the owner of the animals is mauled by their own animals, they had to see
Mm.
that wasn't the first instance of aggression. They had to
Yeah.
see that something was wrong with that animal and they should have acted.
Sure.
So, and in most cases, I've seen of aggressive animals. It's not. There have been signs along the way that
It's not just like a out of the blue something happened
no,
most of the time.
no.
Sure.
Mm-mm.
That, like, my personal dog Bogart is like a behavioral dog, and I got him
Mhm.
off the street. I worked for Habitat for Horses for a really short time, and when I first moved down here, I was like 20 years old, and um he was wandering on the ranch, and I took him home, and he bit two
Mm.
people. And it was like, I didn't know how to control him the right way,
Mhm.
and I've had him now. He's probably sleeping on my bed right now. He's like 11 years old, and he's
Yeah.
a lot easier to handle, but I had to learn how to manage him
Yeah.
and how to be safe with him. And if he were with a different owner, not that I'm amazing by any means, but like, yeah, he could get himself into some trouble
Yep.
for sure.
I
So,
I have two dogs that are biters,
mm,
and I just make sure that I don't ever put the dog in a position to fail.
right.
You have to keep the dog safe. So,
Hmm.
I have a gate so that my dogs can't rush to the front door.
Yeah.
So if someone knocks on the door, they're not going to step in and get bit by the dog.
Yeah.
So, and I have time to calm the dogs down and put them in another room if necessary. So, it's just not setting the dog up for failure.
Absolutely. That makes sense. Um, You might have already answered this, so we can skip on, but I'm going to ask you just in case. You led two major shelters in the region, and both during pivotal times. What were some of the biggest lessons you learned about leading a government funded shelter?
That government shouldn't run shelters. That was the biggest thing I took away
That's
from.
amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, government is not set up to run humane animal shelters. This is
Hmm.
just not part of their package.
Yeah.
They provide services to people.
Hmm.
They're not. They're not. have the mindset for humane
Sheltering.
sheltering.
We have talked though, because you do think that like the if I'm right here, that the enforcement side should stay
Right.
with, yeah.
Absolutely. The enforcement side should stay with the government agency, either under the police department or under the health district or however they have it set up, because that is an enforcement issue.
Yeah.
And that's also enforcing animal laws and making sure that humans are taking care of the animals the way they're supposed to. But sheltering is a whole different thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't believe that governments should run shelters.
So you like the nonprofit,
Yes.
yeah.
I
I
like the
like, because then you
nonprofit.
can raise funds and you can
Yeah,
apply for grants and
absolutely. And
yeah.
if you contract, if the nonprofit would contract with the municipal city to run the
Mm-hmm.
shelter, then they could work out an agreement for funding.
Yeah.
And of course, then the nonprofit can also raise more money through fundraising and things like that.
Sure.
The other thing with the municipal shelters with donations was, yeah, people could donate to the shelter and it would be put into an account for the shelter, but
Mm-hmm.
it was difficult to get that money out when you needed it.
Yeah.
If I needed to take a dog to the vet because it got hit by a car, I
Mm.
couldn't wait 10 days to put in requisitions,
Right.
So that part of it is, part where the government red tape doesn't fit with sheltering.
That makes so much sense. Yeah. Yeah, I can attest to like to, this dog has to go to the vet now.
Right.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay. Okay, a lot of people don't realize that politics and systems are at play in animal sheltering. Can you share a bit about what you've seen behind the scenes, and what it really takes to move the needle for shelter animals? I don't know if you like, I mean, you kind of said it, I mean, moving it to a nonprofit, but any other thoughts on like the political systems that,
Unfortunately, with municipal systems, every time there's a new election, council people change and their priorities change.
sure.
And they always put the animals last
Yeah.
of their priorities. So part of the difficulty is getting to know the council people and explaining to them what the mission is of the shelter and what you're doing and trying to get them to actually come to the shelters to see for themselves. Um, and then, your greatest help is just grassroots volunteers and fosters.
Mm-hmm.
Without them, when I first started working at the League City Shelter, they had no foster program and no volunteer program. And it run exactly like a division of the police department. It was like a jail. You had to ring a buzzer to get buzzed in.
Oh my
The
gosh.
door was locked at all times.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, this is going to take a lot of work.
Yeah.
But slowly but surely, we built up fosters and we built up volunteers. And it's all about transparency, openness. There was no place in the shelter that I didn't allow volunteers to go except for rabies quarantine, and that
Mm-hmm.
was by law.
Mm-hmm.
But there were no areas that were shut off. Everything we did, we had nothing to hide, and I wanted everyone to know that we had nothing to hide, and they were welcome.
Yeah.
And we gained a huge volunteer and foster base in League City just on being transparent.
I like that. Transparency is one of our guiding principles,
Right.
and I think you're right. It's so true, and I always tell like staff specifically, I'm like, people are hypercritical of animal care. It's not a bad thing. That's actually a good thing, but um, I'm like, be prepared to answer questions and don't, like for example, somebody came in one day and was like asking one of the staff like, why doesn't that cat have a bed? And they
Hmm.
explained like, well, the cat poops on the bed anytime we give him a bed. He doesn't really want the bed in there. We give him this hammock instead or whatever. And they
Hmm.
kind of got, upset about like, why would they think we don't care? Like, we wouldn't notice. And I'm like, it's just part of it. Like, but people really care about animals.
They really do.
And you have to be open
Right.
and be okay and know how to handle that.
Right.
Yeah.
And I had a volunteer tell me one time that she said, I'm always afraid when I come in here and I see a dog that was here yesterday that's not here. I'm always afraid to ask what happened to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought about that and I said, okay. So we got a big whiteboard and we wrote down the disposition of every animal that
Mm.
went out. We wrote it on the board. It
Yeah.
got adopted, it's in foster care, it's at the vet, or it was euthanized. So we put little angel wings on it.
Mm.
And we went farther than that. When one time we had to euthanize an animal for medical reasons, it was medical that we just couldn't afford. It had cancer, and
Mm.
we decided to, excuse me, allow the volunteers to come and do a going away party for the dog.
Mm.
So they all got to come and bring him treats and, pet him. And then they felt better about, it wasn't done behind closed doors and in the dark and hush hush.
Yeah.
Everybody knew,
Mm.
and they knew why.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's amazing. Um, so you have a unique perspective on no kill, and I think it's valuable for people to hear. How do you personally define it? And how do you think communities should be thinking about the no kill goal?
Well, I've gone the whole gamut from high kill to no kill.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think somewhere along the line we've kind of lost perspective.
Uh-huh.
Um, if you take out the animals that are medically unable to be helped
Mm-hmm.
and the animals that are vicious or dangerous to the community, you still have 10% of animals. That's only 10% of the animals that
Like
come
that's a
in.
pretty fair percentage.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think that's pretty fair. But I think what's happening is they're adhering to a save everyone at any cost policy.
Mm-hmm.
And what's happened then is that the shelters are all full and overwhelmed, and they stop intake.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when they stop intake, what are the animals on the street doing? They're reproducing.
Mm-hmm.
And it hurts my heart when I hear people say the shelter told me to put the animal back on the street where I found it,
Yeah.
because that puts the animal in danger, puts the community in danger,
Mm-hmm.
and the animal's going to reproduce if it has the chance. And we're just pounding the problem. It's going to get worse and worse.
Yeah.
So I think that, communities and shelter managers need to take a realistic look at the animals that they have in the shelter. And if, you know, they don't have a plan for that animal, a behavioral plan, a medical plan, and it hasn't been adopted for 700 days,
Yeah.
then they need to make that hard decision to allow another animal to come into the shelter
Mm-hmm.
that is adoptable.
Yeah. That makes sense. And I agree. I think that it was like this big okay, well we just won't take them in then. And it's like, well, maybe that's not the answer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Um
And I think, when I went to my very first Austin Pets Alive conference a long time ago,
mhm.
and they said something that was so profound to me. And they said, if you want to become a no kill shelter, just stop killing.
Mm.
And I said, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's figure out something else.
Mhm.
But that philosophy of save every animal is not realistic. We're
And
not
especially
gonna.
not right now.
Yeah,
Like maybe like 100, 200. I mean,
right.
if we're even still around, who knows? But
And we've
yeah.
seen, we've seen instances of where dogs that were pulled from bark were
Mhm.
put in this horrible conditions in
Mhm.
Alabama,
Mhm.
and that didn't help those animals.
That's a good point. I've actually like listened something Bark said. And I don't want to, because I've been reading, they kind of
Mm,
changed their policy of how they share at-risk pets. And part of their reasoning was like, they did not say this. This is going to be Caroline's
mm,
wording of how they said this, but like it kind of brings out for lack of a better term, the cuckoos a little
yes,
bit.
yeah,
And so when you start saying, well, take it or it's going to be euthanized, you have people come in and
right,
that can lead to hoarding. And
right,
yeah, that's
and
the dark underside of the no kill
right,
movement as well.
and
Sure.
we've seen that recently with the lady in Galveston Island State Park who had 71 animals in a
Mm-hmm.
school bus. The unfortunate incident in Baycliff with the
Sure.
cats, with all the dead animals on her property. And these were people,
Who
I'm
would
sure, that started
consider
out
like
with,
animal advocates
yeah,
would
they
consider
started out with good
themselves.
intentions, but they didn't know what they were doing. And
It's
they ended up
hard.
being part of the problem.
Yeah. And like I mean, having a facility with a ton of animals and worrying about funding and stuff, it's really hard. And like I have to, that was part of the reason we needed to get a center is I started having like all these cats in my house. And I'm like, this can go, this is a
Yep.
slippery slope. This
Right.
is a slippery slope.
Mm-hmm.
And moving it to a center where you have staff to take care of all of them. You can't, one person can't take care of 30 cats,
No.
in my opinion, in your
No.
house.
No.
Like, you can't do that.
No. Not
So,
humanely.
not humanely.
Yep.
No, 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 no. I didn't have 30 cats in my house, I
Yep.
must say. It was not that high of a number, but it was
Yep.
enough that I was like, oh man, I can see how somebody
Yep.
might get themselves into a tough position.
And I've seen over and over again people that started out Whiskerville with good intentions.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she had the best of intentions to have a sanctuary for those cats, and it turned into a nightmare.
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm. There's more to caring for animals than just no kill, that's for sure.
absolutely.
Yeah. So as animal lovers, our emotions run deep. You've always emphasized the importance of approaching the work logically. How can we balance our hearts and our heads with animal welfare? I'm sure you've had to have experience with that.
I have had experience with that.
Yeah.
And especially during cruelty cases,
Mm-hmm.
it can be very difficult not to get emotional, but you have to remember the mission. You have to remember what you're there for and what you're doing, and you can go home and cry later, But
That's good advice. Sure.
right, but you have a job to do.
Yeah.
You need to do it professionally. You need to make sure that the animals are taken care of to the best of our ability.
Mm-hmm.
And then, if you got to go home and cry, go home and cry.
Mm-hmm.
Have a glass of wine, good cry. It'll be better the next day.
Yeah. No, that's good advice. We're professionals. We have to do our job. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Can you share an example when making a tough decision, a tough but logical decision led to a better outcome for the animals in your care?
I think probably the one that I saw that made the most difference was opening the shelter completely to volunteers,
Mm.
to let them, you have volunteers are kind of sometimes a double-edged sword
Sure.
because they can be highly critical,
Mm-hmm.
and I've had that too, where they're stomping their foot at you saying, why doesn't this cat have a bed? Because I don't have the money to buy one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right now, wait till the next
He has
budget
food
cycle.
and water. We're, like, yeah.
But but they're also your best advocates.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to kind of, if they stomp their foot at you every once in a while, it's okay.
Yeah.
You just smile and say, if you'd care to donate a bed, we would love that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But just, I think, being so transparent
Mm-hmm.
because they weren't used to that. And they were used to, I think the volunteers were used to being adversaries almost, in both of the shelters that I
Yeah.
ran. And they were like, well, we're here to keep you in line,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't want that kind of relationship. So
So do you feel like you kind of took the lead on maybe building that healthier relationship with
yes,
volunteers?
yeah. And also with our nonprofit in League City, we were blessed to have a wonderful
Sure.
nonprofit that supported us. So, to working with them
Mm.
and the volunteers, and it was a good situation.
What would you be your advice? Because I do know there are shelters out there and stuff who are maybe really hesitant to work with volunteers because of the double-edged sword, as you said.
Right.
What would be your advice to them?
My advice would be swallow your pride
Mm-hmm.
and smile and let your volunteers in. Be transparent. The thing that fosters distrust is hiding things.
Mm-hmm.
If they ask you a question and you won't answer, or you tell them they need to do an open records request before you
Mm-hmm.
can answer a question, then they're going to think you're doing something wrong.
Yeah.
And if you're not doing anything wrong, if you don't have anything to hide, why not open everything up?
Mm.
Except for rabies quarantine, because
Yeah.
by law,
You can't do that.
you
Sure.
can't do that. But everywhere else, I mean, we had isolation areas, we had areas where we kept sick animals,
Mm-hmm.
isolation, stray holds, and normally shelters won't let anyone go in stray hold.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why,
Yeah.
But those animals in a stray hole, they need to be walked too.
Sure.
They need a pat on the head and they need, some loving.
Yeah.
So we
Was it
opened
like did you
everything.
have like good protocols, like, because I guess I'm trying to be like, who would be the devil's advocate? They may be like, well, liability, or was it, or were you just kind of like the um the potential liability outweighs the benefit?
Not really. The city of League City
Mm-hmm.
covered our volunteers with workman's comp.
Oh wow, okay.
So, and we did have volunteers occasionally get bit, because sometimes they were handling animals that were unfamiliar with them, or the animal was scared, or
Yeah.
whatever the reason. But we covered their medical.
Okay.
So, but that is one of the reasons that shelters don't. And again, this is people making those decisions in government
Who aren't
who aren't
affiliated with the
animal
shelter.
people, right?
Yeah.
So the liability is pretty small, really.
That
As
makes
long as your
sense.
volunteers are trained, go through your protocols, make sure that they're being you're overseeing what they're doing,
Sure.
so that they're not putting themselves or the animal at risk. Um, you know, Sometimes accidents are going to happen with animals. It's just the way it is.
Yeah. Then it might, it's, and like kind of like you said, it might be, there's like a shelter director or somebody, they're gonna have to be good at talking to their government leaders and their political leaders
Absolutely.
and having those conversations and
Yeah.
explaining. Yeah.
Yeah. And then every 2 or 4 years, you have to do it again.
Yeah, when the new person comes in.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
Awesome. Okay. Well, we're getting to the end here. So let me just pick one or two. For organizations, whether big or small, aiming for good outcomes across the board, what are the key pillars they should have in place? That's a very intense question.
it
You
is.
you
And
can you
again,
answer?
a
You're like
strong
volunteers.
volunteer program and a
Yeah.
strong foster program,
Mm-hmm.
because the need is so great right now that if you don't have fosters, you're just dead in the water, because
Yeah.
there's way more animals than your systems can take care of.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't have good fosters, and I know recently Lifeline had put out a request for a foster, and one of our very good fosters that was one of my heroes at League City came and got the dog that was a medical dog.
I was wondering because she mentioned that she was from League City. I saw you
Yes.
commented back to
Oh
her,
yeah.
Elisa.
She's phenomenal.
Well, she just took him to the vet this morning. Got laser therapy on his little.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I used to you evolve in this business.
Uh-huh.
And I used to not want fosters to foster from different organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And my thought process was I didn't want cross contamination.
Mm-hmm.
So if they had kittens from us, I didn't want them bringing kittens from an unknown source
Mm-hmm.
where they could cross contaminate them. I've since changed my mind. So Alyssa fosters for several different organizations, and she right now I think has 3 foster dogs and maybe a mama cat and kittens. But she's
Yeah.
phenomenal. She can handle it.
Yeah. That's great. Cool. Okay. And let's end on a good note. What gives you hope about the future of animal welfare, especially in communities like ours?
Young people, young people that are involved
Yeah.
and dedicated, such as yourself.
Thanks. Thanks.
Um, you know, I see a lot of young people now coming into animal welfare. Uh, that's the future. You
Mm.
know, they're the future. You're the future.
Thanks. Well, I hope to do a good job with the baton. And if, okay, one more. If you could give one piece of advice to someone just starting out in animal welfare today, what would it be?
If you're going to start your own rescue, don't. I would say work with an established rescue
Uh-huh.
and learn from that,
Yeah.
and then make that decision.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
and go into it with your eyes open.
Mm.
Know that you have to have a funding plan. You have to have a housing plan. You have to know what your limit is of how many animals you can help. You
Yeah.
have to have a plan for how you're going to get them adopted. How are you going to get them vetted? All of those things go into it. So if a young person wanting to start out in animal welfare, I would advise them, and I have this several times,
Uh-huh.
to work with an already established rescue
Mm.
and learn those things and how it works. And then if they're still wanting to do it, at least they have better knowledge.
That's great advice. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming
Okay,
on
I
today
enjoyed.
and chatting and sharing all your knowledge, and for being such a great part of Lifeline, and leading us to the future. So,
I'm so happy that I still can.
yeah. Awesome. All right, everybody. Well, thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.